Everyone, my name is Deanna and I am obsessed with startup studios and the amazing things that go on behind the scenes to make them successful. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to tell you about this new community that we have launched called Studio Upstart Build. First, let me tell you where you can find it. It's www.su-build.com. So I'll put the link here. It's Studio Upstart Build's community platform. So essentially, what this platform is for anybody in the startup studio industry. So if you're a novice, there's articles, there's how-to, there's reading guides. This will get you caught up to speed quickly. So there's all this content for you to learn from. There's also live forums for you to ask questions and get answers from people that are already working in the studio industry. So it's a great resource for you if you're just starting out. If you're already working in the startup studio industry, that's amazing. And this platform has a lot of content and offerings and value for you too. We produce exclusive research by surveying the entire industry, putting it together with our data scientists, and really making a comprehensive and valuable research report. Once a quarter, we produce that. We also have lots of little research that we put out, monthly. We have live events, where panels, there are question and answer events, there's webinars. Live events are really great for you to draw awareness to your studio, as well as help bring the studio together by providing knowledge for others. What else? We have so many, we have courses, we have masterminds, we have ebooks, we have guides. There's really something for everyone on this platform. I'm so excited to have launched it and to be running it. It's already going really great. There's growth, there's members, there's collaboration, and I'm really happy with it. So we hope you will join. Again, it's www.su-build.com, and it's free to join. So what is the harm? Just join and collaborate and jump in on the conversation, because I promise you it will be worth it. Okay, I'll let you get back to your content now, guys. Okay, so in the last episode, we talked about pre-funding protocols. So these are the steps that someone has to take to get ready to launch a startup studio. At a high level, I'll review them. So you need to develop a kick-ass team. You need to identify your niche and mission. You need to set up your studio as a legal entity. You need to design your branding, which includes a website, and you need to decide on your funding mechanism. So I talked about some of the benefits of bootstrapping a studio, which means starting lean, scaling up slowly, but then really fast. So if you're curious about any of those objectives, I encourage you to go back and watch the last episode. It's called Pre-Funding Protocols. But if you are set on those tasks and you're ready to move on, let's dive into financing a startup studio. In this episode, I will present you with two main structures that studios use to finance their operation and their creation efforts. So typically studios are funded by venture capital firms, and I'll be referring to VC firms throughout this video as a general term for anyone who finances a startup studio, but there are other entities that contribute, like angel groups, corporations, even government programs. I also want to thank Quinton Nickmans from eFounders, a startup studio with offices in Paris, San Francisco, New York, and Berlin. This episode could not have been possible without his hard content creation work, and I've linked to his article on studio financing in the description of this video. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so the first model that we're going to discuss is the fund model. This is a model for structuring the financing of a startup studio. So first we have the studio, and you can see the legend at the top. This will help you discern what these icons are, but I'll also explain them. So the studio creates a fund, and this fund is because they don't have the money or the means necessary to fund their studio on their own. So they have to raise money from some outside investors. And these are the investors. I have them listed as venture capital firms because that's the most realistic possibility, but angel investment groups, even government grants also invest in startup ventures. So it's not unrealistic for you to think that they might also invest in a startup studio, but most often it's venture capital firms. So the venture capital firms, they put in money to the fund.
So they don't invest directly in the startup studio. They put their money into a fund, and each of them get equity from that fund based on how much money they put in. So the way that the studio is actually funded, so the studio meaning the operations of the studio, the salaries for the founders, the overhead for office space, anything that's internal to the studio that doesn't have to do with creation of new ventures, this is what a management fee will cover. So if the studio team can raise a big enough amount of money for their fund, the management fee, 5% of $10 million is $300,000. So that, and you want to raise a runway of about 2 years or 24 months, because that's the amount of time that it will take you to create startup ventures and then also start to be able to spin them out of the studio so that they can become independent ventures on their own. So that's how the studio operations themselves are funded, through a management fee. And now this fund that the studio has raised is being used to create startup ventures only. And this little cog here is the startup venture in this example. So the studio team uses the fund's money to create a new startup venture. And when this startup venture is ready to leave the nest, when it's mature enough to kind of be spun out as an individual independent company, there are dividends or profit that are going to come from a financing or fundraising round, or profit that's going to come from the actual sales of whatever the startup's selling. So when there's money to be distributed from the startup venture, it goes mostly to the venture capital firms because they own 100% equity in that startup venture, because the studio team used their money to create the startup venture. So they own the equity in the startup venture. They don't own equity in the studio. That's a distinction that's important to make. Now, where does the other 20% go? The other 20% actually goes to the studio team and the studio itself, and this is called carried interest. So it helps align the interests of investors and the studio founding team, to have the studio founding team also getting something as the studio startups become successful. Otherwise, they wouldn't really care. I mean, they would probably care because they're studio founders and they're responsible human beings and they're passionate entrepreneurs, but in some scenarios, they might not care how well the startup actually does because they're not getting any money from it. So carried interest helps to align the interests of investors and the studio. Let's go through an example where a studio wants to raise $6 million, okay? So they need to raise $6 million for the first 2 years of operations. Now, let's say each of these venture capital firms put in $2 million to the fund. That is $300,000 that the studio has to run their operations for 2 years, and approximately $5,700,000 to create new startup ventures for the next 2 years. So what happens if there's $100,000 in dividend or profit to come out of the new startup they created over here? The venture capital firms get $80,000 and the startup studio gets $20,000, and those two amounts, the $300,000 from the management fee and the $20,000 from the carried interest, that is what the studio can expect to make over the course of 2 years. So this is the fund model, and this is how it works. Okay, so let's talk about the fund model. The basic things that you need to know are that the equity in the studio-born ventures are held by the VC firms who finance the studio. Secondly, studio operations are financed by management fees and carried interest. So 2.5% to 5% is typical on the management fee side, and 20% is typical on the carried interest side. Sorry about that. The pros of this approach are the fact that there's no dilution from the studio, so the studio founders get to keep all of the equity in the studio itself. 20% carried interest is a really good deal because the studio founders aren't putting in any of their own money. And thirdly, the studio doesn't need to have its own money to put into ventures, which kind of seems obvious, but it's worth stating because that's a question I get asked often. Let's talk about some of the cons. So the VCs own 100% equity in the studio-born ventures. That is a big con. Even though the founders own all of the studio equity, they don't own the equity in the ventures that they create until they start putting their own money into the fund, so that's a problem. The other thing is that management fees are typically not large enough to cover the operational costs of the studio for 2 years. Unless you can raise a huge financing round and get a lot of money into that fund, a 2.5% to 5% management fee isn't going to be enough to fund the studio ventures. And carried interest doesn't kick in until there's a startup that's ready to leave the studio and become its own venture and starts creating profit and has dividends to give out. So you can't really count on that carried interest to kick in until 24 months down the line. Okay, now let's go over the second model for structuring the financing of a startup studio. This one is called the holding entity model. So venture capital firms invest money directly in the startup studio. In exchange for that funding, the startup studio provides equity to the venture capital firms. The venture capital firms will get the equity in accordance with how much they invest in the studio. So this is what it looks like. The venture capital firm and the studio are now essentially business partners. And when a new venture is created from within the studio, they split the money from that venture when it either hits a sale and has exit money, or it has dividends to pay out. Whatever the case is, when the startup makes money, the venture capital firms and the studio split the money in accordance with their equity structure. This is a very simple and clear and easy to understand model for financing startup studios. Now let's do a little example. So let's say that the studio is willing to give up 30% equity in their studio. So in exchange for funding, they're giving the VC firms 30% equity. The VC firms now have 30% equity in the studio. The studio founders now have 70% equity in the studio. And when the startup ventures begin, producing a profit, have an exit, there's dividends, something of that nature, and there's money to be paid out, the venture capital firms and the studios are paid in accordance with their equity structure. Let's go over some of the pros and cons of the holding equity model. So the pros are that the studio gets to keep equity in the ventures they create. That's a big pro. I mean, as a startup studio, you're creating ventures because you're passionate about them. You want to make sure that you have some equity in those ventures so you have a reason to see them succeed. And that goes to my second point, that the equity share aligns the incentives between the VCs and the studio. Thirdly, the studio doesn't need to have its own money to put up into ventures right off the bat. And then also, this model is a lot simpler than the other model that I just showed you. So it's easier to explain to VCs and get them on board. Now, some of the cons of this holding equity model is that the studio doesn't have full decision-making power over how to spend their money because it's not really just their money. Like, the VCs are business partners with the startup studios, so they get a say in who's hired, what ventures they create, like the whole 9 yards. So you do have to share decision-making power with the venture capital firms that invest in your studio. The other con is that the studio is diluted to a degree. And thirdly, it can be tricky to convince investors to get involved without a track record of generating above average returns. So you really have to prove that you're a studio that's going to be able to get this done and prove that you have a venture strategy and that you're getting better over time. So those are some of the pros and cons of the holding equity model.
So which model should you choose? If I had to give a hard and fast answer here, I would tell you to go with the holding entity model because it lets studio founders keep most of the equity, and it allows the studio to not only have funding for creating the startup ventures, but also for internal operations like hiring new talent, maintaining office space, and paying for tools. At the end of the day, you know, studio founders will, with this model, own 70 to 80% of their studio and of the studio's shares in the startups that they create over time. And studio founders will need to allow investors the privilege of first returns, which means paying the investors before the studio gets paid. But this model is simple and it builds value over time, and it will do, you know, what you need to get done as a new studio. Once your studio has matured and you start seeing returns on the startup studio ventures that you're creating, you can branch out and experiment with other models where your studio is contributing funding alongside investors. So that is all for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned some new things. Remember to join the Startup Studio Build membership platform. It's exciting. It's a community where you can learn how to build a startup studio and talk to others that are doing it. The link is in the description of this video. Be sure to subscribe to this channel so you get notified when I release the next video. As always, I am Deanna. This is Studio Upstart. Thank you and have a great day.